Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we take a look at the semifinals, the Bucks and the Atlanta Hawks. What is the most important matchup to keep an eye on, and who's the most important player for both of these teams? Camille and I will dig into the matchup preview coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of the day and for checking out the Locked On Bucks newsletter. That's right, your favorite podcast now has a newsletter available daily and for free. Sign up now at lockedondaily.com, lockedondaily.com to start your day with the all-new and free Locked On Bucks newsletter. Today's episode is brought to you by Robinhood Gold. They provide the privileges of a high net worth for any net worth. These generous benefits are now available for only $5 a month. The new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. Sign up at robinhood.com/gold. The Bucks and the Atlanta Hawks tomorrow afternoon. Camille, it is a 3:30 Central Time tip. And we touched very briefly on yesterday's show, looking at that first matchup and just here's what the Hawks have been doing recently. But today is more of a, okay, here's everything you need to know about the Atlanta Hawks and our thoughts going into this matchup. I mentioned the matchups themselves and how important those could be. We will get to who we each think is the most important player for both of these teams when these teams tip off on Saturday. But let's just take a look back at that game just over a week ago, December 4th, that was played in Milwaukee. The caveat there, Camille, was it was night 2 of a back-to-back for the Bucks, and I think it was a stretch 2 of like 5 games in 8 days or something along those lines. I didn't have a great feeling for that reason alone, and the fact that the Hawks have been playing very well, and that is what played out. We mentioned the Bucks had a lead as high as 10 early in that game, but the Hawks would outscore them 32-24 in the second quarter, and outscored the Bucks by 4 points in the second half to pull away to a 15-point win. But looking back at that again, knowing it wasn't a Bucks team that was optimized in terms of rest. They did not have Khris Middleton back on the floor just yet. What, if anything, stood out to you the most about that game? Because, look, it is fair to say not much because of the schedule and everything else for that team.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about how Doc Rivers talked about it, like, I'm not even going to review much film from this game. I'm just going to move on to Boston at this point. And whenever a coach mentions, like, this is not one we're going to spend a lot of film time on, that always stands out to me. Because as you mentioned, it was the second night of a back-to-back. Doc mentioned he probably should have went deeper into the rotation that game just to give guys some fresher legs, some opportunity to play, and kind of save some of the guys who played the night before in Detroit. But the one thing that stands out to me is just the amount of times that the Hawks were able to get out and run on the Bucks. They had 26 fast break points at halftime. The Bucks didn't give any in the third quarter. They did a better job in the fourth overall, which showed, like, again, if you focus in on it, you can figure out a way. But they also give up a lot of points in the paint to that Hawks team. It's a Hawks team that loves throwing the alley-oop, loves the cuts. And Trae Young is a gifted enough passer to get those passes to the guy they need to get to. So just the pace that the Hawks play at stands out to me from that first matchup. About the turnovers the Bucks have as well. The end of that first quarter, there was that stretch where it was like the Bobby Portis turnover, and then Dame had 3 turnovers in a row, and then Brook had a dunk to kind of bring the score within like 2 or 3 instead of down by 5 after they were up by so much. So this is one of those games going into it where it's like looking for those Bucks turnovers, looking for those Hawks fast break points, and also after seeing what the Hawks did to the Knicks the other night, just making sure that the Bucks can keep them off of the offensive glass.
It's 25-15 was the score there, and early in
when the Bucks were up
in the first quarter, and the Hawks closed the quarter on a 23-10 run.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that Brook play was basically it. Otherwise, it was even uglier. And that first quarter. So to me, not a lot stands out. And I don't say this as there's nothing to worry about. The Bucks are going to win this game, because there are some things that should make you very nervous, which we will get to. But what you mentioned about Doc Rivers and his post-game comments after the fact, too, again, no Khris Middleton, changed things, as well as we've seen those changes offensively for this team since his return. But Doc, in his post-game comments after that game, said we were dead-legged most of the game. I didn't think we thought well, and I didn't think we executed well, and that's usually a sign of fatigue. Giannis and Dame tried to will things into existence for us, but I really wish I would have played around 12 guys in the first half. We talked about it before the game. I don't know if it would have mattered, but every once in a while you have these scheduled games where you feel like it's going to be an issue. Let's get into the second half and be alive. See if we can steal this in the second half with those extra bodies. We just had an emotional game last night. Came back to this when it felt like a scheduled loss. You're going to lose a game at some point. It doesn't turn around what we've done. But we won't watch a lot of film from this one tonight, was basically summing up what he said after the game, which, again, take the rest out of it. The Hawks were well rested as well. I don't know how much it changes things, to Doc Rivers' point, because there's some things Atlanta does very well that the Bucks are going to struggle with and have struggled with. They struggled in the first matchup between these two teams. They've struggled so far this regular season with those things. One of them you already hinted at. Another one, a bit of a surprise coming into the year that you would have thought, hey, I think the Bucks are going to be pretty good in this area. And I know Frank has talked about the numbers quite a bit. It has not been the case for this group defensively. So we'll get into what those areas are. But, just looking back at that game before we start to move on to these matchups, what the Hawks did is no different from what they've done in most every other game I've seen of the Atlanta Hawks this season, in what they did just the other night in New York against the Knicks. Balanced attack offensively, had 3 double-digit scores off the bench. DeAndre Hunter played very well, had 20 points off the bench. Jalen Johnson had a big game. Trae Young, as we talked about, he's deferred a lot more, but Trae Young had some big moments for the Hawks with 17 points there. They just get these waves of athletes that can score and defend, and it allows Trae Young to really pick his spots. And more importantly, it means there's not really one guy to key in on if you are the opposing defense.
There's not just one, because they're going to move the ball. And if you're not disciplined on your rotations, or you're not helping the way that you need to be based on what the scheme is, like, you're going to get eaten alive. And you saw that with the Knicks, who were making good rotations against the Hawks during their quarterfinal game, but it was like the Hawks were still just one pass faster than however the Knicks could rotate. So it's going to be a test for the Bucks, because you can't key in on anybody. Like, you can key in on Trae Young for sure and be like, we want to make Trae Young uncomfortable. But we also know that Trae Young has no problem trying to find his guys and set them up for success either. So it's like, well, how can you take that playmaking aspect out of Trae's hands? What do you do defensively for Trae Young? And if whatever you do, like if you're showing extra help, how does that open up the game for the rest of his teammates, who, again, he has no problem getting the ball to? Like, Jalen Johnson is the guy for me who, throughout this season, I mentioned he's just taken a leap, and he has been one of their engines. He has a good feel when it comes to passing the ball as well. He's going to be aggressive on the boards. He can get to it at the rim. Like, he just has a really nice all-around game, and he seems like he's learned to play with pace a bit better, when to deaccelerate, when to put the speed on. Like, it just feels like he has more control of the game. So Jalen Johnson is one of those guys for me where it's like, keep an eye on what he does. And Trae has been pretty cold from 3 as well. Like, the numbers just haven't been there for him. What I'm hoping for is that in Vegas, in this game, it's not the time where Trae Young is like, hey, I got it, y'all. Like, here we go. Y'all remember how I get down. So the Bucks just have to be disciplined. Like, you can't have those mental lapses against the Hawks, because they will take advantage of it, especially against better teams, because they've lost to some poor competition, but they have beat quite a few good teams.
Something we've seen from the Bucks quite a bit in recent years too. They're up for that level of competition. So some of the things that stood out from that game, I mentioned one a little bit surprising, and those matchups to really focus on who's the most important player on the floor for both teams if we take Giannis out of the mix for the Bucks. We'll get into that conversation coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is sponsored by Robinhood Gold. With Robinhood Gold, you don't need a silver spoon to eat up the financial favors of the 1%. Robinhood Gold allows others to get the rates and perks usually reserved for the high society. Now, the resourceful individual with Robinhood Gold can earn the very liberal rates of 4.25% APY on uninvested cash and be rewarded with a handsome 3% retirement boost on IRA account contributions. Robinhood Gold provides the privileges of a high net worth for any net worth. These generous benefits are now available for only $5 a month. The new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. Sign up at robinhood.com/gold. Terms apply. For product-specific disclosures, visit robinhood.com/gold. Investing involves risk. Rate may change. Gold membership is offered by Robinhood Gold, LLC. And as we mentioned at the top of the show, Camille, your favorite podcast now has a newsletter as we introduce the Locked On Bucks daily newsletter. One stop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered to your inbox daily. Sign up for free now at lockedondaily.com. That is lockedondaily.com to start your day with the all-new and free Locked On Bucks newsletter. So some of the things that stood out from that game, the Hawks got quite a bit of steals in that. You mentioned the turnovers that we saw, especially early for the Bucks in that game, but the Bucks finished with 18 turnovers, which isn't an eye-popping jump off the page number. We've certainly seen that number in the 20s at times this season, but you just can't make, and I think we saw some of the similar things in that game against the Magic, who I think we referenced on yesterday's show. There's some similarities between teams like the Magic, certainly the Houston Rockets, to a lesser extent the Hawks, but that, short roll pocket pass that we see Dame Lillard make quite a bit, it's tough to pull off against the Magic, against the Rockets, because of how athletic and aggressive they are defensively, and we've seen the same for the Atlanta Hawks. It's not just the great barrier thief in Dyson Daniels either. DeAndre Hunter was terrific in that game. We mentioned his scoring, his defense as well. He's really been playing at a high level for the Hawks of late. But Bogdan Bogdanović had 5 steals in that game. I mean, you had those 3 guys that I think combined for 11 steals in the game. It's a very handsy group where you have to be aware of where guys are at all times. And you see Trae Young make some of the passes that you think, can't do that against this Hawks defense. That's the funny part, is their defense takes advantage of some of the plays that their offense makes.
Yeah, and that's part of why they're so difficult. To your point about just how active they were with their hands as well, that also poses a problem in those situations where Dame is driving to the rim. He's not looking to score, but he's looking to kick out. Just because they have such athleticism and such length, like it's kind of hard sometimes to get those passes out. So another area to keep an eye on. And I think for the Hawks, if they're also productive during the time when Trae Young is on the bench, that's a problem for Milwaukee.
Yeah.
We saw them able to build a lead, like keep it even while they were playing the Knicks when Trae was sitting. And that's an area to look at. DeAndre Hunter, I'm glad you brought him up. I saw the Locked On Hawks host, Brad Rowland, mention the fact that he's watched Hunter for like his entire career at this point. And he said the ball that Hunter has been playing for the last 2-3 weeks is like the best of his career. So if this is a real leap for Hunter, he's going to be someone else on the wing for the Bucks to really have to focus in on, which again makes that Khris Middleton addition back into the rotation really interesting, because in the first matchup against the Hawks, it was DeLon Wright minutes in that time frame. You still had AJ Green, you still had Bobby Portis, you still had Gary Trent Jr. off the bench, but that fourth guy off the bench was DeLon Wright, who has now fallen out of the rotation with Chris's return. So looking to see how that is for the Bucks, as well as Taurean Prince's minutes. Know that he has been dealing with the illness, and in the Celtics game, he just was like, I can't go anymore. Sat the rest of that one out, and the minutes have just been a little bit lower for him. So also seeing what it's going to look like for Taurean Prince in this game, and how he's feeling with the rotation. So again, we seem to know what the Bucks 9-man rotation is. which does make me wonder what the Khris Middleton addition will do for the Bucks in this particular game. I would assume, again, we're going to be able to get the playmaking. We've seen some good defensive plays from Khris as well. Again, the lateral movement, not necessarily all the way there as it was, a few years ago, but I feel like he's been moving fast and having active hands. Like he's been playing some pretty good defense. So on the Bucks side of things, I'm really looking to see how Khris Middleton comes in and changes the equation for this team in this matchup, since we just saw them last week and a half ago. It wasn't that long ago where we last saw the Hawks.
9 days ago so it's going to be 10 days in between games for these two teams. And the Hawks, two things that they do really well that one, the Bucks have struggled mightily with start to finish. The other we've seen become an issue at times is defensively. The Hawks are 6th best in the league in turnover rate, in the percentage of possessions that end in their defense forcing a turnover, 6th best in the league. Dyson Daniels is a huge part of that, but the other guys we mentioned, DeAndre Hunter on both ends of the floor playing much better. Bogey had 5 steals in that game. Zachary Rissache with his length. It's a team that can get it done there. Jalen Johnson's a two-way player as well. So that part isn't surprising. The other part that is a major issue for the Bucks is work on the glass. The Hawks are the 5th best offensive rebounding team in the league. And, you go back to that first matchup between these two teams. It's not always as easy as just looking at the raw numbers and say, well, the Bucks got X amount of rebounds, the Hawks got this, because of, taking things into account of how many opportunities did you have, how many shots did they miss versus you. But Camille, the Hawks had a near 39% offensive rebounding rate in that first matchup, which, it's not as though that's an outlier for the Bucks. We've seen more and more of that this season.
We have, and that's an area where the Bucks are going to have to tighten up, because when you look at the Hawks as a whole, and you're like, well, they're not really that good. Like they have the 16th best offense, the 14th best defense. Like they're middling. So you're like, well, why is that concerning?
By the numbers, you mean, before
by the
Hawks
numbers,
fans that are lurking come after you. Yeah.
By the numbers. So you would look at that and be like, well, what's the threat? And the threat is the area that you highlighted. It's the fact that they're able to crash the offensive boards at such a high level to generate extra possessions for them to continue to try to get on the board. It's the fact they're able to force turnovers, get out and run and get easy buckets that way. So for the Bucks, they're going to have to cut out the quote unquote easy Hawks buckets. You have to get back in transition. You're going to have to box out on the glass. And in addition to that, for Milwaukee, this is a Milwaukee Bucks team that gets to the free throw line at a pretty decent rate, 12th best in the league right now. The Hawks don't necessarily do a bad job at fouling. So how is that going to come into play for the Bucks? Because a lot of times in the games where Dame is looking to get going, we've seen him get going at the free throw line. We see Giannis, with the way that he plays, get to the free throw line. I'm going to be really curious to see what this whistle looks like during this game as well, because if that Hawks-Knicks game is any indication, it's playoff like whistle for these games where they're letting guys play, get away with a bit more physicality. And it's like, well, what team does that benefit? And my first thought would be like, well, that will benefit the Hawks based on how they like to play defense. So the Bucks are going to have to be ready for that as well.
The Hawks run the fewest plays in the half court of any team in the league. So it speaks to the pace that they play at. And for context, the Bucks run the 3rd most percentage of their offensive sets in the half court. So two very different styles, which then leads to that transition piece that you mentioned, Camille. And Atlanta Hawks run the 3rd most frequency of possessions in transition, but they are far and away number 1 in transition offense coming off of steals. So we said it's all kind of linked together. They get a lot of them from work off of live rebounds. They get even more off of steals, and that kickstarts their offense, gets them on the run. They're just okay at their efficiency in transition, but it's like anything else. We've talked about at times earlier this season when, one of the big problems with teams out rebounding you is the more possessions, the more opportunities, the more shots you get, the more you're going to score, and the more those are going to start to go through, and that just increases your chances of winning. It's the same in transition, where we've talked about before, hey, Bucks defense still giving up a ton of transition opportunities, but they've been much better. They're right around league average, just slightly better in their efficiency defending that. It's still not a formula you want to mess around with too much. You would like to see that frequency number come down, because the more cracks at it the Hawks get, the more they're going to start to finish there. So that is going to be very important to see the Bucks work on the glass. And we'll kind of wrap up this point with some of the other areas that stood out from the Hawks this season, from the Bucks, but especially from that first matchup, and some of the importance on these margins that the Bucks are going to have to win tomorrow in order to win this game. We'll get into that conversation next here on Locked On Bucks. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is sponsored by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more. And do all of this on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So, to me, Camille, we asked, who's the most important player? What's the most important matchup? I don't know that it's necessarily player specific. To me, it's the work on the glass.
Yeah.
Like, the matchup is, can you hold your own rebounding the basketball? Are you not a disaster in defensive rebounds? That's going to go a long way in bringing success to the Bucks on Saturday. So for me, it's not player specific. It's statistically driven of, can you match up well on the boards?
That's fair. That's probably what I would say too. But since you took that, here's what I'll add on to that, which leads me to Bobby Portis. He is somebody who, against the Hawks last time, he had 5 boards against the Hawks during that very first matchup, and the Bucks were out rebounded considerably in that game. The Hawks finished that game with 54 rebounds to the Bucks 40 rebounds. The only Buck who had double-figure rebounding numbers was Giannis with 11. Next closest was Brook with 6, and then you had Bobby with 5. What do those numbers look like for Bobby? And when he's on the court, like, I feel like since Khris came back, Khris has helped put a defensive battery into Bobby's back in a certain way. And Bobby mentioned in a some podcast, I can't remember which one he was on, but he was saying, like, Khris is always on his case, and it's almost impossible for him to not try to play better defense when Khris is on the court or around, because Khris is always holding him accountable, saying, like, you didn't box out here. You need to do this, do this, do this, do this. So Bobby was pretty much like, Khris is always on my heels when it comes to defense. So, like, I can't help but be a better defensive player when he's around. So, like, Bobby Portis is one guy who I'm looking at, because we've talked about the Bucks' big rotation and what that looks like. It's Giannis, it's Brook, and it's Bobby. And that's the end of it to the most part. So, like, what impact can Bobby have on the game? Like, we saw him go crazy on the glass against Boston, but, like, what can you do against this Hawks team that we know is going to be very aggressive trying to attack those boards as well?
Camille, we missed out on a great crossover opportunity, because that podcast was the Run It Back podcast on the FanDuel network that Bobby Portis was on, where he gave that discussion there. You mentioned Bobby. It brings us to the most important player for both teams.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'd go as far as saying he's the most important, because, again, the ultimate of caveats here is Giannis every single game is the most important player for the Milwaukee Bucks. But to me, a very important player, kind of going off of what you said about Bobby Portis, is Brook Lopez.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen a lot. I'm sure we'll see more of it in the comments on this show, of the can't play Brook against the younger, athletic, quick, fast teams. And I just don't subscribe to that, at least not yet. I don't know that that's true. He's very important in those spots. And you look back at, and I'm not trying to say you play Brook Lopez 40 minutes and get him to run up and down the floor. You have to dictate the pace and the tempo and where the shots are coming from. Brook Lopez is the guy that allows you to do that. Because if we go back to that first matchup, it wasn't a great game. And even going back to the Nets game, I didn't think Brook and the Magic game wasn't terribly effective early in that game and both of those games. And I think that led to Doc Rivers going smaller. One of the things that we've heard him talk about and saying that he wants to do, you have the opportunity to do it now. But I think Brook has to be effective early in this game, and that you have to have a solid Brook Lopez game, not necessarily, Brook Lopez scoring 20 points and racking up the numbers, but he has to be there protecting the paint and at least imposing that threat, because that is the other thing the Hawks do well, that lob play with not just Trae Young, everybody on the team. DeAndre Hunter sealed the game against the Knicks on a lob play as well. So they run that play so well. A lot of it is Trae Young, but a big part of it too is their athletes around the rim. DeAndre Hunter and his ability, Clint Capella, one of the all-time lob threats, and Onyeka Okongwu. The Hawks do that play as well as anybody. And in the first matchup, the Hawks took 40 shots at the rim against the Bucks and converted on 26 of them. So when you talk about points in the paint, they scored 64 against the Bucks in that first game in the paint, and 52 of those points came directly at the rim. So to me, that's the area where Brook has to be effective. Brook has to be one of those guys that is at least a deterrent. You're not going to stop the Hawks from running the lob play, and you're not going to, hey, we held the Hawks to 20 points in the paint. That's not going to happen, but it can't be in the 60s, and it can't be 50-plus points at the rim that they're getting.
Absolutely can't. And the crazy thing is that looking at Brook Lopez's numbers, the last 3 games, Brook Lopez has not registered one block over the last 3 games. He didn't get one against the Magic. He didn't get one against the Nets. He didn't get one against the Celtics. His last game with the block was actually that Hawks game.
And I was going to say where he had 3, and I think they were all very early.
Yes, and that was a stretch where he had 5 games in a row with 3 blocks, where he had them against the Hawks, the Pistons, the Wizards, the Heat, and the Hornets. So it's like, to your point about the rim protection as well, block numbers aren't the end all be all to anything at all. Yeah. We understand at this point in time with how analytics work, you can look up defenders' percentages at the rim when they're being, defended by a certain player. But for Brook, just seeing him get active, like get some of those blocks, just be active at the rim, I think is going to be really big for him. And one question for you, just with this game coming up, which is on Saturday, as we've mentioned, if the Bucks win that game, they play on Tuesday for the championship. The 83rd game of the season doesn't count for regular season. It's its own entity. It's NBA Cup records only. How are you feeling about the Bucks getting that extra game added onto the schedule if they do defeat the Hawks? Because they are an older team. Injury concerns have been discussed. Like, do you have any qualms about the possibilities of an 83rd game if the Bucks are able to take care of business against the Hawks?
I personally don't. I know there's been some of it out there, and I mean, I can't talk you out of it if that's how you feel. Certainly, the age is a big part of it, but the time off that the Bucks had around those games, and even the fact that if you play in the championship game, you're still getting 2 days off in between games. I don't really have an issue. Like, if this was last year's schedule, because
it was tighter last year.
Yeah, we've talked about it before, and it's easy to forget that, hey, last year you played the Knicks in the quarterfinals on a Tuesday. You won Tuesday night. You played the Pacers in the semifinals Thursday afternoon. I think it was like a 2:00 Milwaukee time or 4:00 Milwaukee time tip. So a day and a half later, you're playing that game. Then that Saturday, you're playing the championship game. And then I think the schedule resumed that Monday. So it was just right back into the mix for all of these teams. So last year it would have been even more of like, I know Doc Rivers said if there's a trophy, we want to win it because we're competitors, but maybe it would be in your best interest to sit this one out and take this one off. I'm not there right now, given the way that the schedule is, but I get it. And I would imagine if the Bucks win, it's going to be a decent amount of the discussion that you hear in some circles of, is it in the Bucks' best interest to, like not necessarily punt this game, but let's keep an eye on minutes, especially if it's another slugfest with the Houston Rockets.
Which I think is good for him. We were talking, I believe, after we recorded the Thursday episode, and I mentioned like with how the schedule was shaping up for this team in December. And it was like, people kept saying the Bucks are only getting fat off bad comp for the most part. So adding in these games that are a little bit higher stakes, adding in some teams that are going to present a real challenge, I think is going to be good for this Bucks team. In addition to that, I think you will appreciate that, and all other wrestling fans out there will appreciate this. I was having a conversation with my Tech File co-host, and Eric J mentioned that this is important. It's a championship. Like, it's not the championship, but it's a championship. The NBA Cup is like the intercontinental title of the NBA. And it's like,
potentially.
Hey, like, go ahead and get it. It's a chance to win something. Go ahead and get it.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't work out for the Lakers last year. So just trying to think of the brief history of IC champions. I don't know, did Damian Sandow ever win the Intercontinental title? That maybe that was the comp for the Lakers. But yeah, I mean, you can certainly make a stronger case, I think, for teams like the Hawks in what this can do to propel you if you win it, or at least get to the championship game. We had those conversations about the Pacers a year ago, and we kind of joked. It certainly feels like the Hawks have just straight up stolen the identity of the Indiana Pacers this season here. But we both mentioned players that stood out to us in terms of their importance for the Bucks. As we wrap here, I've got one player in mind, but is there one for you that is the most important to, I suppose you would say, contain for the Bucks on the Hawks team?
It's probably a combination of, you said one. So it's either Trae Young or Jalen Johnson for me. I'm going to go with Jalen Johnson just because he has been more of the offensive load carrier for the Hawks so far. Like, again, Trae is setting them up beautifully, but Jalen Johnson is somebody who has really been making a way for himself. And a random honorable mention to Okongwu, not necessarily for what he does offensively, but just the energy he's able to bring off the bench defensively and on the glass. Like, he is somebody you're going to have to control.
Yeah, and he has routinely done a pretty good job against Giannis throughout his career. Has Onyeka Okongwu. I was thinking about both of those names that you mentioned, and Jalen Johnson. Obviously, we saw this start last year, and it's carried over, and he's been tremendous for the Hawks this season. Trae Young was another one that I thought about because, again, if we're making these comps versus last year and the Pacers and the moments and Trae Young just rolling dice on the logo at Madison Square Garden, this guy is up for the moment Saturday in Las Vegas. But he's also one of those guys that, and it's not exclusive to this year. We've kind of seen it at times throughout his career. It does seem like it's the assists you have to focus on more than the points, because when those point totals are high, it's not always a good thing for the Hawks. Like, case in point, this year, I think they're 3-7 in games where he scored 24 or more points. To me, the guy that I ultimately landed on is DeAndre Hunter, because of the way that he has been playing of late this season, especially. I mean, the last 10 or so games, but he's the opposite story. And you mentioned Brad Rowland talking about, hey, this is the best basketball he's played of his career on both ends of the floor. You looked at DeAndre Hunter when he came into the league out of Virginia, and I know somebody that knows him very well that said, we all expected this to happen, and it's finally fallen into place for him. This is the guy that we watched at UVA and said, man, this guy, the prototypical body, the game too as well for 3-and-D, like, he should be a can't miss guy. And it does feel like now we're starting to see that in games this year. Just to speak to resurgence is he's 27 years old. So resurgence is the wrong word to use, but just continuing to add to his game in games this year for DeAndre Hunter, where he scores 20 or more points. And again, he did that against the Knicks. He did that against the Bucks. When he does that, the Hawks so far this season are 9-1 in those games where DeAndre Hunter scores 20 or more points. So to me, that's who I ultimately landed on. If he's playing incredibly well of late, if DeAndre Hunter has a big game, I don't think it bodes well for the Bucks.
It's fair, because when we look at his numbers, he's averaging almost 20 points a game as we wrap up here, averaging almost 20 points a game this season, a career high for him, while shooting 44% 44%, 45 if you want to round up, percent from three, another career high. He has never shot better than 40% from three in his entire career. And he is shooting 45% from three right now on a pretty decent, highest volume of his career as well, with 6 threes a game. So like the Bucks are going to have to be locked in.
Yeah, we are 24 hours or so away from seeing how locked in they are. We talked about this on yesterday's show. I do expect a much better showing, at least for the Bucks, just the way they've been playing of late in this season as a whole. I think it's going to be a very good game and an entertaining one. I think both of them are. I mean, it may not have the star power of LeBron James and the name of the Lakers in the foursome that you have advancing this year, but I think these are two very good matchups, and it should make for a very, very good day of basketball on Saturday. And then who knows, maybe there's enough that comes from this that we're doing another weekend post-game show, and we're getting set for a Tuesday night game for the NBA Cup Championship.
I would love that. I'm not gonna lie. I want the Bucks to win it. I want to see them do it, especially after how they started the season. Like, I get they're the old team coming in, the young teams have something to prove, but I think this Bucks team has something to prove as well with how they started the season. To kind of, media doesn't matter, but like with everything that's been talked about, like to get this championship, NBA Cup championship in the middle of the season, I think bodes well for how they started the year as well.
Been eerily quiet since on all fronts of the Bucks are a disaster, trade market, all of that. Haven't really heard that much in the last couple of weeks here. That'll do it for today's show, though. Maybe we'll have another bonus episode over the weekend, depending on the results that we see and how it looks in terms of the optics. But stay tuned for that one. That'll do it for today. For Camille, I am Justin. We will talk to you guys once again on Locked On Bucks.